Good morning. I really want to thank you all for the invitation to come and spend an hour with you this morning. A special thanks to Open Circle and the Lake Chapala Society. I have a lot of things I want to talk about. I talk really fast. I'm really informal. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A, and I'll hang around afterwards if you have additional questions. But I want to start by talking about what I learned very early on in coming to Ahihi. My first visit here was about 5 months ago, and what I learned is that all roads lead to Ahihi. Everybody here has a story about how they ended up here, as do I. So here's my story. About 6 or 7 months ago, I was on a plane. I don't even remember where I was. I just know that I was not in my hometown. And I was getting seated in my seat, and I heard somebody call out my name. And I remember thinking, I'm in this foreign country, who knows me here? And I look up, and it is the wife of one of our surgical doctors from the Mayo Clinic. Have any of you heard of the Mayo Clinic? Of course, everybody knows the Mayo Clinic. So I got up, and we're standing in the aisle, and we're chatting, and she said, you know, it's been a couple of whiles. The pandemic has really slowed our work down. She said, Aldous and I would like to hook up with you in the near future. So when we get home from our trip, we're going to give you a call. And her husband was seated a few rows behind her, and that was kind of that. He waved. You know what? It's going to keep slipping off of my hair. Does that work? Okay. I'm going to wear it like a crown. It'll stay on better that way. So she said, we'll connect when we get back from our trip. A few weeks would go by, her husband would call me, and he would tell me that his wife, who is a medical translator from the Mayo Clinic, is originally from the state of Jalisco, and that she had a nephew who had returned to Jalisco and had formerly worked for the Senate and was in post-retirement and was coming to make a home here, and had recently been hired as a hospital to do some community work with that hospital. Can you hear me? I feel like, okay, all right, give me the high sign if you can't. And he said, would you be interested in doing a surgical campaign with them? And I said, sure, absolutely. So we exchanged phone numbers, and I called Lorena's nephew, and we had a brief conversation, and I was going to be in Mexico in a few short weeks, and said, I'll make a trip down to Guadalajara and we'll meet. I came down to Guadalajara, and at that first meeting, we had government officials, hospital officials, and people from the community. Smile Network provides life-altering surgeries to children around the world born with cleft lip and palates. 100% of people that work in conjunction with Smile Network are volunteers. So we have world-famous cleft surgeons from around the world that provide their services to us free of charge. When we come in country, we bring a full contingency. We bring anesthesiologists, surgical nurses, volunteers, translators, pediatricians. We bring in a team and work with us. But there are 3 requirements that we need when we come to a country. We need, 1, a hospital partner that we are not going to pay. We need them to donate the hospital and pick up the ancillary costs. We also need to work with government officials. We are Americans and Canadians, and oftentimes we have Peruvian participants. We come from around the world, and we need to know that we have government officials who are helping pave the way to the work that we are doing. I've been doing the work for 21 years, and at that first meeting, government officials and hospital officials and community were at the table. It generally takes me about 4 or 5 trips back to a community to get all the players at the table at one time. After a 3-hour meeting, I left Ahihi with a surgical site. In 21 years, that has never happened. So I am home, I get home on a Thursday night. On Friday morning, I hear from an old friend of mine. I had the opportunity for many years of working with the estate of John and Yoko Lennon. Ever heard of them? So John Lennon was an artist. After John died, Yoko made a promise to him that the world would remember him as an artist. And I had the privilege of touring the United States with the production crew that sold John's artwork to benefit children's organizations around the world. And the producer, Larry, and I have remained very good friends all these years later. So Larry calls me, and he always calls me Jackie O. And he says, Jackie O, where have you been? Have you been traveling? I said, just last night I got back from Mexico. Where in Mexico? I said, oh, a little place that you wouldn't know. And then our conversation continued for 45 minutes. At the end of the conversation, he said, well, I really need to get going. My partner is leaving for Mexico tomorrow. I said, where in Mexico is he going? He said, oh, no place you would know. No place you would know, a little place in Mexico. And I said, well, I know Mexico pretty well. Where is he going? I hear him ask his partner where he's going, and he says, Ajiji. And I'm like, oh, Ahihi. Larry, you're never going to believe that. That's where I just came from last night. Why is Bob going to Ahihi? He said, well, his good friend, Mike Platt, lives in Ahihi. And I'm like, I know Mike. I met Mike 20 years ago when I was doing the Lennon exhibits with you. And he said, yeah, that Mike. So Mike Platt and Bob, Larry's partner, Mike Platt and Bob Pratt are best friends. And Bob is coming to visit Mike. And I'm like, oh, we should all get together. That was just the beginning. I would make a couple of subsequent trips back to Ahihi, and Mike knew Richard and Ryan, who wanted to host a cocktail party for Smile Network so we could introduce the community to Smile Network. I attended the cocktail party and talked for 20 minutes, and I had people coming up to me at the end of the cocktail party introducing themselves and donating $500 to sponsor a child's surgery. Total strangers. There was a gentleman that evening by the name of Steve Cross, who I know is in the audience, and Steve came up to me and said, well, when you're here, do you need a car? I have a car that you can use. I've known the guy 30 seconds. And he just said, let me know when you're coming. Here's my WhatsApp information, and you've got a car. And it would continue from there. We had people in the community at that cocktail party offering food and shelter for our patients, housing for our doctors. And it was always incredible to me to ask everybody, how or why are you here? And all roads do lead to Ahihi. So I want to tell you a little bit about my personal story and Smile Network that started 21 years ago. So I come from the corporate world, and I had debated many times in my mid-40s about leaving the corporate environment. I had gotten to a point in my life where I no longer was motivated by making money for a large corporation. I see a lot of heads nodding. I wanted to do something that was more purpose-driven. And every time I left the corporate world, I got lured back in on another project or another offer. And on the last pass, I was the senior vice president of the Rainforest Cafes, which is a United States-based restaurant concept that has restaurants around the world on all the Disney properties in the world. And I traveled frequently, and I said, this is my last gig. I'm going to finish off this gig, and then I'm going to figure out what the second act of my life looks like. So on my first day of unemployment, I have always worked from the time I was a very young woman, and I always traveled internationally. And so it was a treat to still be in my pajamas at 4 o'clock in the afternoon that day. I got my young kids off to school. They were in elementary school at the time. And I had a fascination of Oprah Winfrey. And I never was home to be able to watch the program. So at 4 o'clock, as I'm lounging around, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can watch Oprah today. She comes on at 4. I turn the TV on, and you can't make this stuff up. She opens the show by saying, if you're a woman in your mid-40s and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life, this is your show.
The ad.
And I am not good at taking advice from anybody. I'll be the first person to admit it, and especially a talk show host. But when Oprah said to me, this is your show, go get pen and paper, I was on it. I ran upstairs, I got a notebook, and for the next hour, I was absolutely mesmerized and feverishly taking notes. She had an author on that day by the name of Paul Bronson, who had written a book called What Should I Do With My Life? It's Bronson's assertion that we all have a purpose in this life. And most of us do not come into our purpose until later in life. Sometimes young people in their 20s or 30s they find out what their purpose or their passion is and they're able to apply it, but most of it's not until much later. And what oftentimes we miss is that as we're developing a skill set as homemakers, as electricians, as business people, as travel agents, real estate agents, we are developing the skill set that will transfer to other things. And his other assertion is that we get so stuck in our lives in routine. And sometimes if you just step out of the routine, the trajectory of your life can change. So when you hit that stoplight one morning and instead of making a right turn to go to the office, you make a left turn and you see something different, and that may trigger something different that becomes the trajectory or the launch point for what you're about to do next. At the end of the show, my kids were coming home from school. I changed out of my pajamas and put the kids in the car, and we drove to a Borders bookstore. And I bought 10 copies of the book that night. I read my copy cover to cover. And I had been noodling this idea about creating a service project and thinking about who some of the great mentors in my life had been and who I would want to engage in that service project if I took the lead. After reading the book cover to cover that night, I woke up the next morning and at the author's recommendation, made the list of what I wanted to do in the next chapter. And it was really short. I wanted to travel more. I loved photography. I wanted to expand on the photographic work that I had done. I wanted to open up a retail store. I don't know why. I love to shop, but I had no retail experience. And there were 6 items on that list, and the last one was to create a 5-hour-a-week service project. I then distributed the 9 other copies of the book that I had to those mentors that I had identified, and asked them to read the book, and that I'd like to get everybody together in the next couple of weeks and talk about this potential service project. One of the individuals that I would hand the book off to would read the book and call me a few days later and tell me that he thought I needed to meet with a local producer in Minneapolis who was a storyteller and produced documentaries. So I met with the gentleman, he asked a couple of questions, and he knew that I was contemplating a trip to go to Mexico. I wanted to find out or find a location where we could begin doing surgical cleft work. I had some experience with another organization. The gentleman who made the introduction to the producer had a home in Guerrero and said that we could use that as a base. So as the producer is asking me questions, he said to me, total stranger, said, if you would have me, I would like to be on that trip with you. Give it some thought and we'll touch bases in a couple of days. So I'm starting to hear from the other 9 people who I'd given the book to, and the project was gaining momentum, and I felt like I was ready to go to Mexico. I had a place to stay and use as the base. I called the producer and said, okay, this is my plan. If you're in, this is the date that I'm leaving. And I was bold and I was brave and I was going for it. And then when we were sitting on that plane and the plane took off, I looked at this stranger and said, what the hell am I doing? And the sheer panic set in. And he said to me something that really changed the future for me. And he said, Kim, sometimes in life we just all need somebody that will just push us off the end of the diving board and know that the net will appear. And if you need me to be that person who says, go for it by pushing you off the end, that's what we're going to do. And he goes, just be you and do what you do, and it's all going to fall into place. So we get to the house in Guerrero, we drop our bags, we hadn't eaten all day, we headed to a local restaurant, and we sat down at the bar while we were waiting for our table. And in those few minutes that we were talking, we were writing strategy on cocktail napkins. And I said, okay, this is what I know I need to do. I need to locate a hospital partner. I need to make contact with the governor of the state of Guerrero, and we need to determine what the need in Guerrero was. And he said, well, what kind of background information do you have on the hospitals here? I said, really none. He said, oh, do you know the governor? I said, I don't. And he said, what about the need? I said, I know there's need. I've been working in Mexico. I can't quantify the need, but I know there's need. There was a gentleman sitting next to us. And the gentleman, I could tell, was listening. And I assumed he was Mexican. And in perfect English, he leaned over to me and he said, I'm so sorry, I've been eavesdropping. And despite the fact that I was on my second margarita, I was very clear that he had been eavesdropping on the conversation. And he said, can I ask a couple of questions? So as he's asking questions, he then says to me, well, I'm from the state of Guerrero, and I think I can help you. Okay? He said, I used to be married to the current governor's wife. You can't make this stuff up. You cannot make this stuff up. And within 12 hours, we were in the governor's mansion in Acapulco meeting with the governor. After a 2-hour meeting with the governor and his wife, we were driven by government officials to the general hospital in Acapulco, where I met a beautiful human being by the name of Dr. Marco Antonio Adame, who ran the hospital. And within 2 hours, he had committed to hosting our first surgical campaign. Mind you, we didn't even have any medical professionals yet. This was still all an idea. A few hours later, I was in a government escort up to the mountainsides into a village where they knew that children, indigenous children, lived that had unrepaired cleft lips and palates. So in the space of a very few short hours, it all came together very quickly. And what I would tell you is that when I took the leap, the net did appear, and what I didn't know is that the universe had a much bigger plan than I did. As Darlene, right? No, tell me I'm sorry, Melody, sorry. As Melody had said earlier, 21 years later, we have a presence in 19 countries, from Africa, India, Armenia, throughout Latin America, Haiti. We have a presence on 5 continents. We've operated on 4,500 children around the world. And post-pandemically, we are starting to work with indigenous nations in the United States and working with the Native Americans to provide oral health care, much needed oral health care on the reservations. And if there's time today, I'll talk a little bit about that. I would come back from that trip with that producer. I would call the 9 people who I'd given the book to, and one of them said, I'm going to host the meeting at my office. And the producer that was with me had been filming along the way, and he produced a beautiful little video that we showed at this meeting. What I didn't know when I was coming to the meeting, I anticipated meeting, very informal meeting with 9 people, 10 people. When I got to the meeting, there were 62 people in the room, and there was a large circle. And Steve, the gentleman who was hosting the meeting, who would become one of our founding board members, had taken the initiative of calling friends and people who thought might be of aid to our organization. And an organization that didn't even exist on paper yet. It was still an idea. It had only been about 3 weeks since the program. And so when we presented the film there was a gentleman who came up at the end of the meeting, and he was very tearful, and he said, I want to share with you, I just had a son. And as I'm seeing those kids in that video, what I realize is the only difference between my newborn son and those children is access. And he said, I'm privileged, I've had a great life, I can provide for my children, those parents can't start. At the end of your presentation, you said you were asking people to help, and you didn't quantify, because honestly, I didn't know what I needed at that point. But I thought if they could be of assistance, provide connections, direction, you were open to all of it. And he said to me, does $10,000 get you started? I had known him, he was a person in a room. That individual would become part of the founding organization as well. So as I said, the universe had a much bigger plan than I did. What I've also learned, and the book illustrated it so well, is that I had purpose in the second act of my life. I'm a school teacher by profession. I was very young when I graduated from college. I was 19 years old with my 4-year degree. I had completed my degree in 2 years. I grew up in a family without a lot of resources, and I was hell-bent on getting out of my set of circumstances. I was smart, and so I could apply my smarts to my studies, and I was in a hurry to complete my degree so I could get out of Dodge. And I have tremendous love and compassion and respect for my parents, but I didn't want to be that kid from Fridley, Minnesota at 19 years old. So I took my first teaching job, and I loved what I did. I worked with children with special needs. Do we have any school teachers in the room? So there is a special place for school teachers in heaven. I only lasted for a year. The school systems are very political, and in those days, this was 45 years ago, in those days, children that had any type of disability were clumped together. And we really didn't have programs or resources or programming to really address those needs of the kids. And they were oftentimes sent to these other classrooms to be babysat. And so I was really disillusioned at 19 years old. I was very idealistic. I didn't have a grasp on the real world. And so I lasted for 1 year. I had grown up in the restaurant business. I worked my way through high school and college as a doctoral at Lord Fletcher's. For those of you who are from Minnesota, which I know St. Paul Mark is from Minnesota, another Minnesotan. I was a doctoral, and I went on to be a waitress and a bartender. So just for future reference, if you're hosting a party in Ahihi, I'm the kind of guest you want to make, you want to invite, because I know how to clean up after everybody. I dump ashtrays, I pick up glasses, I'm still very good. That skill set never left me. But I got into the restaurant business and did, as a young female in a predominantly male industry, did very, very well. But in my mid-40s, it just was no longer moving me. I had the opportunity to travel the world with those experiences, but something was missing. And I know I needed a purpose-driven cause. I needed to feed my soul, not my wallet. The thing that moves me most about this work is I think that all human beings have one thing in common. And it doesn't matter if you're 4 years old with a cleft lip or palate, or an affluent 70-year-old with resources and an amazing life. We all want to be a part of something greater than ourselves. We all want to fit in. And if you're a child born with a cleft lip or a palate and it goes unrepaired in your lifetime, if you have a disability, if you are different, oftentimes you are not part of something greater than yourself. You are isolated, you are shunned in your communities if you are a child with a cleft. And I knew that I had found my purpose. People always ask me all the time, why did you start this organization? What was it about Kids with Class? What it was, and I could never answer this question for many years without getting emotional, is Kim from Fridley, from a family that didn't have a lot, and everybody knew our business. I was ashamed of that, and I was embarrassed by it. And I didn't feel like I belonged to something greater than myself. So the way these children felt, that resonated with me. So does everybody in the room just know what a cleft lip or palate is? Because maybe I'll just give you a quick overview. If you are born with a cleft lip, what it means is you have a gap in the front of your mouth, and oftentimes it goes up into your nasal cavity. So the inside of your mouth is exposed, your nasal cavity is exposed. As a newborn, all newborns are beautiful, right? But as that face of an unrepaired cleft lip patient develops, it becomes unsightly. As you grow into an adult and you have an unrepaired lip, your nose hairs are exposed, the inside of your nose, your jawline, your teeth. You have a lot of problems associated with that. If you are born with a cleft palate, birth defect, when you put your tongue to the roof of your mouth, part of the roof of the mouth is missing. So if you think about it for just a second, you're a baby, and you, particularly if you come from a poor community where breast milk is the primary source of nutrition, if you have a lip and a palate disability, you can't suck on the nipple. Oftentimes I go to very poor places in the world where the solution is to provide formula and bottles for these babies. They don't have the ability to buy formula. They don't have the ability or access to those bottles. And so naively, in the beginning, when we were working in Guerrero, I worked with a formula manufacturer in the United States and got a boatload of formula to a community where there were a lot of indigenous children that were dying from what is called failure to thrive. They were slowly dying from lack of nutrition. And we had a couple of kids on this mission. Mom just can't get enough nutrition in them because they're feeding them with eyedroppers. They can't suck on the breast. They don't have the fancy bottles and formula. But we delivered a bunch of formula to this village, and I would go back 6 or 9 months later to check on the progress of some of our kids. And somebody did one of these, and they pulled me over in a farm, and they opened up a storage bin. And what was the storage bin full of? Formula. And I'm thinking, I was like, what is going on here? And the formula was being given to the pigs. But, shocking, right? But what the person told me is, we don't have clean groundwater source. They can't afford bottled water. So it wouldn't go to waste. They got really fat pigs, but it wasn't going to its intended purpose. And we learned some of those things along the way. I've been given a 10-minute signal, so I kind of want to jump ahead a little bit. One of the things that's important to know about children born with cleft lips and palates is that oftentimes in remote villages, when a child is born in a village with an unrepaired or has an unrepaired lip or palate, the prevailing belief is that child is cursed, and that it is a curse as a result of something that a transgression of the parent. And villagers believe that if the child is allowed to live amongst them, their livestock will die, their crops will perish. Those parents love those kids, but the villagers are fearful of those children for what may result in the village as a result of their presence. I have met parents who have been locked to fields by villagers who have demanded that they leave their child to die in a field. And the myth is the myth. It is what it is. As crazy as it sounds, it is a prevailing belief And when a child receives the gift of surgery from a sponsor, the curse is lifted. I want to tell you a couple of patient stories until Melody tells me I can't tell you anymore, and I want to leave some time for Q&A. Generally, I tell people if it's later in the afternoon, when I start telling stories, is you need a box of Kleenex and a shot of brandy. But it's too early, so maybe you have Bailey's in your coffee. We have a tagline at Smile Network, $500 changes a life. In the space of 45 minutes and for just $500, a life is changed. What our organization does is we raise money to transport some of the best cleft surgeons and anesthesia providers in the world. The children in Jalisco who are getting free services from our all volunteer teams. We have 2 paid employees at Smile Network. I worked for almost a decade, 55 hours a week before I took my first paycheck from this organization. I'm told this community is very philanthropic. 80% of every dollar that Smile Network takes in goes directly back to a child's surgery. So when you give us $500, that $500 cost of surgery is achieved by when I add up the cost to transport a team by air, house and feed them for 10 days, divided by the number of surgeries we do, we come up with kind of that round figure of $500. Could be a little less, could be a little more, but in the end it all washes out to about $500 a surgery. Over 4,500 children have received the gift of surgery because of somebody like you. These surgeries change the trajectory of these children's lives. If you are born with a cleft lip and palate and it goes unrepaired, this is what your future looks like. Oftentimes you will never go to school. Oftentimes you will never have a job. You will never get married. You will never have children. You will never do all those things in life that you and I take for granted, all because poverty and lack of access to services or a safety net and the difference of $500 to change a life stands in the way of that child. So I want to tell you about one of my all-time favorite patients. I have 4,500 patients, so if you want to hang around until next Friday, we can talk about all of them. I met a woman by the name of Rosalba. Rosalba was somewhere in Peru. And Rosalba was in her 70s. And Rosalba had what was called a bilateral cleft. So she had an opening on both sides of her mouth. Her cleft was so high that you could totally see the inside of her nasal cavity. A woman like Rosalba, it would be unusual to find a woman with an unrepaired cleft that had married. She was one of the lucky ones. She had been married and she had 5 daughters. And she was at the surgical site unbeknownst to her husband. One of her daughters blocked her. She was very emotional. She was very fearful. In her 70s, she had never even been to a doctor. And now she's contemplating a surgery. She looked around the room. She saw all the children. She knew her odds of getting a surgery were slim to none because we prioritize children over adults so we could get them into school and reduce the post-traumatic stress that happens for these children. We had a pediatrician who was really advocating for Rosalba, and he said, I was sitting next to him when he asked the question, the translator answered. The question was, at this age, why is this surgery important to you? Her response was that she wanted her husband to know that he had married a woman who was worthy of his love. And that what was important to her was to be able to wear lipstick once in her life for her husband. And because of her cleft, she didn't have the confidence to do that. Something so simple. We had an Aveda corporate sponsor with us on that mission. I'm sure to this day, that village is receiving lipstick from Aveda. Not just Rosalba, the entire village. We had a young man here, Oscar. Oscar's 19 years old. He's in the photo being hugged by Lynn. Oscar is 19 years old. He comes from an indigenous family. When he was born with the cleft, Mom made a deal with Mother Mary and prayed and promised Mother Mary that she would not cut her son's hair until he had received his last surgery. This family had very, very little. They had nothing. We operated on him on Thursday. When he came into screening, Oscar did not make eye contact with anybody. He hung his head. When he was spoken to, he looked up over the top of his eyebrows. He was very shy. He lacked confidence. The whole time he sat in his chair during screening, he was wringing his hands. And we placed him on the surgical schedule. He had been fortunate. He had had some surgeries in his life. They were not the quality of surgeries that our doctors provide. And that's no knock on the surgeons who did it. Ours are highly skilled, highly specialized. Cheryl from the States, Kansas, if I remember? Texas. Kansas, Texas, they sound alike. Shared with me that she had a brother born with a cleft in the States, and I think she said that he had 13 or 17 surgeries over the course of his life, because many of the techniques that we use today were not perfected then. And he suffers, can I share? Post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of all of those surgeries. But I can assure you that as a sibling of that child, so do her siblings. So Oscar has had many surgeries. They were not great surgeries. His nose was flattened. His face was a little lopsided. Dr. Aldous White from the Mayo Clinic did Oscar's surgery, and when he came out of surgery, he was beautiful. In 6 months, you are never going to be able to tell that that young man had a surgery. When he was leaving the hospital, he had been circling me all morning. I knew he had something to say to me. And he grabbed one of the translators. And he shared with me that his life had been very challenging and very difficult, and that he had been bullied most of his life. He was in high school. His dream was to go to college, a family with no resources. But the bigger barrier was not the resources, it was his self-confidence. And the morning after he came out of surgery, we gave him a mirror after he was out of surgery for about 3 hours. And I stepped out of the room, and I kind of stood in the corner of the hallway so he couldn't see me, but I wanted to see what he was doing. And he was in a lot of pain, but he looked at himself in the mirror from here, and he kind of worked his way. And this went on for like 2 minutes. And the whole time he was doing it, there were tears coming down. So when he finally stopped me in the hallway and shared his dream about going to college, he said, "I'm going to work really hard. I want you to be proud of me. The barrier for me has been my confidence because I'm afraid of being bullied, and I'm committing to you that I will pursue an education so that I know when I am at a point in my life where I have resources." He didn't use resources, but when he could do something for somebody else, he would do it as a payback for his surgery. Mom was standing next to him. Mom was crying, but Mom was also excited because Mom told me the first thing that was going to happen when he got home, they were cutting the brake. That was now down to his rear end. I'm going to tell you one story, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. Every once in a while, a kid comes along who absolutely steals your heart. There's a poster somewhere of Sergio. He's holding his picture, a before and after picture. I have to tell you a really quick story about this. When we went to find him 6 months later, the photographer that took the picture, brought his before picture so that we could get a picture of him holding his before picture. The picture got lost somewhere. There was a landslide. We were heading up 8 hours into the mountains to find this kid by truck. 2 hours back, we had dropped the chassis of the vehicle we were in. The woman that we were with went into the village and convinced a total stranger to give us their vehicle to go the next 6 hours. As we're going up the mountain, can't make this stuff up. Landslide. We have no idea if it's going to be 2 hours or 2 months before somebody comes and clears the landslide. In the distance, we see a building. We start walking to this building. It turns out it was an orphanage run by Christian nuns. I suppose that's a duplicate, right? Christian nuns by nuns. And as they were feeding us lunch, and as we were having lunch, the photographer spotted a picture of Jesus on the wall in a framed picture. He asked the nuns if he could take that framed picture, and he returned it. So when we found Sergio in the village 6 months later, he had on the same clothes that he had had on the day that we last saw him. And in the real picture, Sergio is holding up a picture of Jesus. When Marty got back to Minneapolis, he would superimpose the before picture over Jesus. Okay, back to one last kid. We had a little, perfect segue. I didn't plan this. We had a little boy by the name of Jesus. Came to the mission site. Jesus was born with encephalitis. He had a very large head. He had a shunt in his head. He had a severe cleft lip and a severe cleft palate. He also could not close the eyelid on one eye, so he sleeps with his eye open, which creates a whole other set of problems. There was a lot of disfiguration and distortion. Mom was a single mom. She was told that when Jesus was born, he was likely going to die soon. Mom and Jesus had a different plan. They were warriors. Mom told me that in her village, he was shunned because of the belief system and that she had no support in her community. She made the trip to Ahihi solo with no support from anyone, and his surgery was about 3.5 hours in length. If you get a chance this week, go to our website or our Facebook page, Smile Network International, and see his story. It is absolutely, the transformation that took place in 3.5 hours was incredible. I committed to Jesus that when we return, and we are returning probably in February or March next year, I'm finding an eye surgeon in the United States who I'm going to make pay his own airfare and volunteer his time to give this young man an eyelid, and we are going to come back and do his cleft palate. As they were getting ready to leave the hospital that day, all these families had come in together on a bus from KARE-11. I know I don't pronounce that right, but you know what I'm talking about. And they were waiting for all of the patients to be gathered. So we're moving them all into a room, and everybody was assembled except for Jesus. 5 minutes before I walked into the room with Jesus and his mom, Jesus' mom told me that Jesus had no friends because of his birth defects. And she hoped that this, and she was crying, she told me that she hoped that this surgery would change the trajectory of his friendships. We hugged, she said thank you. We walked down the hallway to the room where the rest of the group was waiting. And when Jesus and mom walked in, everybody in the room turned around and started chanting Jesus' name and applauding. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. We had a little 2-year-old patient who had previously operated her cleft lip in Mexico City, and because of sponsors, she had been transported to Ahihi and was here for her cleft palate. And little Kelly, who is also on the poster, is like Miss Personality. And she walked up to Jesus, and Jesus was twice her height, and she wrapped his arms around the top of his legs and hugged him. And as I watched, Jesus, I know, had never been hugged by another child because he was stiff as a board, and this little girl was showing affection. And I looked at Mom, the tears are rolling down Mom's eyes, and Jesus does not know how to respond to this hug. So he starts to kind of fidget and kind of move. And every time he does, Kelly puts a bear hug on him and is not going to let him go. And in that moment, when I looked at Mom, I knew that her prayer for friends, for her son, had been answered. And it happened because of a community like this. And if I had another hour, I would tell you all the amazing miracles that have happened because of this community. So I know Melody is going to give me the high sign, so I'm going to open it up for questions.
Let's hear it for him. What a treat. Miracles happen, magic happens. Thank you so much. We're going to open up for questions. I am going to come around with the mic. Do not talk until you have the mic in your hand and put it up to your face like this. Okay?
So while Melody is walking with somebody, I just want to say, volunteering adds years to your life. Studies prove it. If you're not engaged with me or with somebody else, find a purpose, find a passion, roll up your sleeves and fill your cup. The giver becomes the receiver.
The question I've got is, what happens if the kids get left behind, that you don't have enough time to look after?
Okay, great question. So here, we screened 64 kids, and I think about 34 or 35 kids made the surgery schedule. Every child that was a candidate was on the schedule this time. That rarely happens. When we started 5 months ago, we had 0 kids on the list. We are up to 300 kids. So we know, and now the word will start getting out in communities. People are going to go back to their rural communities. The word will get out, and the list will become greater. We make a long-term commitment to the communities that we work with, and I'm going to continue to come back and bring my surgeons until every one of those kids is done. I have relationships in states throughout the world, communities throughout the world, that we have continued to go back to 20 years later because a need still exists. So we keep track of them. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Anybody else?
Where are the surgeries being done for this area? And what doctors, what hospitals?
We are working at Rivera Medical Center, and I need to do a huge shout out to the compassionate caregivers at the medical center. This would not happen without their partnership. I had the opportunity to meet with them yesterday, and they have committed to something right after the first of the year. So Rivera Medical Center, amazing people to work with. Mark.
I just wanted to know more about how you're going about the outreach for the community, the indigenous communities here in Mexico.
It happens in a variety of ways. We have, I've been coming back and forth in the last 5 months, doing interviews with Televisa, local papers, the Guadalajara Reporter. There's a podcaster in Guadalajara by the name of Marco Torelli, who has brought in incredible amounts of patients to us. So we continue that effort. The beauty is from here, the word is just going to get out. It's going to be word of mouth. And I also want to shout out to the DIP of Hohotepec, Ixtlahuacan, and Chapala for their efforts, the Red Cross. We've had so many people working on our behalf to get to these kids. But you have to come in and build trust. You know, these families are told, don't take your kids there because the Americans harvest organs. That sounds crazy, but if that's what they believe, they're not going to bring their kids. And they're fearful. They've never been to a doctor, let alone a doctor that is a different skin color and speaks a different language. So we have to build trust and rapport with the families and with the patients and with the community. You know, everybody is skeptical when a nonprofit comes in. What is their ego? Why are they doing this? We're here because we have resources, we have skill sets, and many of my medical professionals are approaching the latter half of their career, and they are in a position in their life where they can give back and they want to give back.
Anybody else?
I love the question. I'll stay as long as you want me to. And you can leave when you need to, and I won't be offended.
What was the name of the book and the author again?
Paul Bronson, What Should I Do With My Life?
This might be too technical, but as opposed to developed countries like the United States or Canada, the percentage of this deformity is greater in
I can address that. Yeah.
And the question is the prenatal care of mothers. Is there any attempt?
Yep, it's a couple of things. So there is a genetic predispositioning, and it's more specific to certain races. We find that within indigenous cultures, whether we're working in Latin America or Africa, there is a much higher incidence within certain races of a predispositioning, a genetic predispositioning. The prevailing belief that one of the major causes of cleft lip and palate birth defects is a result of lack of folic acid in the mother's prenatal diet. So everybody talks folic acid. In the United States, we prescribe prenatal vitamins, right, full of folic acid. Nobody talks about poverty. And the real issue, in my opinion, is in the States, and if we are families, middle-class families or families of affluence, we have access to healthy foods. In the indigenous cultures, they are poor and they do not have access, and I strongly believe that poverty is one of the root causes. And why we see such a higher predispositioning in the indigenous cultures is because they are the forgotten. They are the ones that we have put on the reservations. They are the ones that we moved out to the rural countryside. If we don't see it, we don't have to deal with it.
When are you planning to do this event again?
If you'll have me back, I'll come back. I'll fly back. I'm not, because I haven't been invited, but I would love to come back. And I'm here often. I'll be here 4 or 5 times before the end of the year.
Anybody else? Burning question.
I think, maybe he was just scratching his head around.
Okay.
Sorry, I have a little fly
Then
here.
let's thank him for being here. Let's look at the flyer that she sent with her QR code. Let's go to her website. Let's support her. And we're done. Thank you.